Philip of Macedon, which was our concluding subject last week in discussing some of the origins of Greece as a nation leading up to the period we're wanting to specifically begin now this evening, we see the embryonic stage of the New World Empire that's soon to come upon the scene. Remember that we had only discussed Greece with respect to it being an ancient nation. We looked at some of the ancient poetry and the epic writings and so forth of Greece, but during none of that time was Greece ever considered to be a world empire. If you think of those dates back to the time of the Trojan War, and we're talking about the period of some of the judges in Israel. We're talking about the time of Homer. We're talking about the prophet Isaiah, where Assyria is the world empire at that time. But as we're working our way down toward Philip, and Philip is most important in the first place because of his personal fulfillment of the first dream that he had, and secondly because of the production of a man by Philip who will fulfill the second part of Philip's dream. Philip is extremely important when it comes to considering Greece as a world empire. Now, all of this had been foreshadowed. The victory of Philip of Macedon, which we've discussed before, what's going to happen afterwards, Greece basically rising on the scene of history to take over the decadent and dying Medo-Persian Empire. All of this had all been foreshadowed in the Persian Wars in 490 to 480, whereas I've said before, Greece, for the first time, A, showed to herself, and B, showed to the world her intellectual and her military superiority over all the older cultures, namely Medo-Persia, which at this time is quickly passing off the scene. And it takes sometimes an impetus like that for you to, or for them, or for you to show to yourself and to others the power, the intellectual, the military power that Greece had, that Greece had never been able to demonstrate because, remember, we're still stuck with the problem in that time of the autonomous city-states, which is what produced the number one problem for Greece in her lack of unity and consolidation, which, if she had been successful in securing earlier, no doubt Greece would have taken over the world prior to the time that it did. But Philip's success helped to consolidate Greece as a nation, which fulfilled the first of the twofold aspect of King Philip of Macedon. He dreamed, and no doubt people had dreamed before him, of Greece as a united nation. We discussed the golden age of Pericles, the golden age of Athens, Greece as a democracy in its heyday, democracy in the sense that Athens was, and Athens was the capital. Of course, as a new world empire comes on the scene, it's not going to be a democracy, that's for sure. You don't get very far. We Americans know that in a hurry. You don't get very far when you try to be democratic, give everyone their opinion, and they want to sue the president, it's all right, and all of this type of stuff. You don't get very far that way. So no doubt before Philip's time, people had dreamed of getting rid of the rivalry, the petty bickering among the city-states, but no one had been successful in doing that. Because it seemed like anyone before the time of Philip who ever had a thought like that was either a Theban, a Spartan, a Corinthian, or an Athenian. And when you're a part of one of those four city-states, we said those are the four chief, you can hardly think independently. You think, yes, let's unify and let's make all of Greece subject to Athens, is all you can think of. It's not that pure nationalistic love that Philip had living up in Macedon, which, let me just add this, by the way, technically he's not a Greek. Sometimes you'll even read that the Macedonians and the Greeks were two different people, and really that's true, because the Macedonians descended from a different stock of people. But they considered themselves to be Greeks. They wanted to be associated with and attached to the Greeks, so we'll let it stand with that. But no one had that purely nationalistic impetus and desire that Philip had. Let's see this country, because, you know, as an outsider, sometimes you can look with more favor and a more pure favor upon a country than people in the country itself. That's been proven time and time again by immigrants that come to this country from, say, Eastern Europe, and this country is just the world to them. And Americans, well, we could take it or leave it, they say. But from someone who comes on the outside and comes in, they have a different outlook on this beautiful, beautiful, perfect country. They want to strive to be their best to help give something to this country for all this country has done for them. So if you'll pardon all of the romanticism in that, then we'll go on. But no doubt Philip had some of these thoughts in his mind, because we're going to see that a descendant of his certainly did. So the first part of his success, first part of his dream is a success, the unification of Greece. The fulfillment of the second part. Do you remember what the second part was? We told you that last time. The fulfillment of the second part of the dream fell upon the shoulders of that 18-year-old general. Who was his son? Who was none other than Alexander the Great. Not just an important name in history around which legends have surrounded, so that we really can't tell what's true and what's false. There are characters in history like that the historians and the legends propagated by the local people have blown out of proportion. It doesn't seem to be true with Alexander the Great. He was that 18-year-old general that we told you about in the last battle that we discussed under Philip, who was in charge of the cavalry, who routed the Persians as they were attempting to take Philip and his men, retreating up a hill, and even ended up saving his father's life, who was at the point of death from a group of Persians at this time. 18 years old. Now again, you read that and you just think nothing, but put it in perspective for today. There are no 18-year-old generals. That is an impossibility, to be an 18-year-old general. But he wasn't just an 18-year-old general because he was an 18-year-old son of the king. That would be one good argument. Well, he had inside connection. No, he was a brilliant horseman. He was a brilliant leader. He had fiery oratory. I mean, he got it in his genes from his father. Remember, Philip, over the winter, had inspired his men with his brilliant oratory, and they had copied some of the tactics of some of the other soldiers around them to teach them warfare. Well, Alexander the Great had this and then some. Now, just before Philip was assassinated, which we've already told you about before, he had already made complete plans to cross the Dardanelles and to fight Persia. Now, this wasn't something, as I've told you before, people, because they don't know anything about Philip of Macedon, just think that this was Alexander's doing. This was all of his plans. Alexander was the one that dreamed of all this. He was the initiator in it all. And no doubt there are probably people here in the church that never heard of King Philip of Macedon before we came and taught you about him. We've all heard of Alexander the Great, but he had a mentor, which was his father. And his father had made these plans to cross the Hellespont and fight Persia. But he was assassinated in 336, and Alexander, who at this time was 20 years of age, is appointed king over Macedon. Alexander was born in 356 BC. 356 BC. I won't give you dates of death and everything. We'll get to that when we conclude his life. But in 336, obviously he's 20 years of age. Now he's gone from a general 2 years before to king of Macedon, king of Greece, and soon king of the world. A thing or two about his personality. No one ever embodied the spirit of Hellenism quite to the extent of Alexander the Great. There are many Alexanders who come later, hence the name the Great. But if we just refer to him, the shortened form of Alexander, or we'll just call him Old Alex, you'll know who we're talking about. No one ever embodied the spirit of Hellenism. The Hellenes, that was just another name for the Greeks. The worship of the body and the mind of man. a pure nationalistic outlook. It was for the philosophy of Hellenism that he wanted to conquer the world. It wasn't for him personally. Now that may be hard to believe, but it seems to be true. Obviously, he was selfish, like any lost man who ever lived or ever will live is. But he had a tremendous, tremendous obligation he felt, a duty that he felt was placed upon his shoulders to convert the world to Hellenism, or the Greek way of life. He was personally tutored by the famous philosopher Aristotle. Did you know that? Some people didn't. Aristotle was a personal tutor of Alexander the Great. And you know a little about Aristotle from Christian ethics, of all places. So this Alexander the Great's not some barbarian. He's a brilliantly educated, thoughtful, and resourceful individual. An avid reader, by the way. Everywhere he went, especially in his conquests of Persia, he took a personal copy of the Iliad and the Odyssey. Amen. That's why we've discussed them before. See, if I wouldn't have discussed them, you'd say, well, what's that? Some people would. We have any fifth graders in here, they'd say, well, what's that? What's an Iliad? What's an Odyssey? Something like the Champ. You read that in the paper today? How do you like that? It's very interesting. We've said before back in creation, we wouldn't be surprised at all that the abominable snowman really exists, that the Loch Ness monster really exists. Some ancient dinosaur. Yeah. There are ancient dinosaur lizards, that's what they're called, that still live in Indonesia today. 10 feet long, whopping lizards. Throwback to the period of the dinosaurs. Whenever I was over in Caesarea by the sea, Roman Caesarea, not Caesarea Philippi, when I was by Roman Caesarea, I climbed upon an ancient aqueduct. No one else was brave enough to go up that high, but I got up on top of that, right there by the Mediterranean, and just covered with big, huge lizards. But when I say huge, I mean like maybe a foot long. You're used to these little 1 or 2 inch things that scamper on fence posts, you know, in the fall time. But a big foot-long lizard's a big lizard. What about a 10-foot long? Like an alligator, a lizard. That's a throwback to the dinosaur period. All these strange creatures that we have out there. We could easily have some strange creature in Lake Champlain. But it's not like what people think it is, though. I mean, maybe some of the educated people, they're guessing that it's some form of a dinosaur, which would really hurt the whole theory about them dying out trillions of years ago. You know, if they died out a couple of thousand years ago, that's okay. We can have a few around. And my word, no one's even searched a tenth of the surface of this planet. Say there's no dinosaurs left. Man can't even go down to the bottom of the ocean out there. What's down there at the bottom of the ocean where the pressure is so immense it just smashes anything down there? Maybe some huge creatures down there. But with all of this Hollywood stuff, it's like it's a monster out to get people, you know. That's what you think of when you think of a creature. It's some monster that's out to get people. No, he's not. Just a regular old dinosaur. Just like a lot of regular old dinosaurs used to walk on the planet. But that's not what the Iliad or the Odyssey were or are. But he carried those with him. And oh, was he inspired in reading the account of Achilles and Odysseus and so forth. He was a deep, deep believer in the Greek way of life, and he felt that it was his responsibility to go and to convert the world to his way of life. So here are a few of his plans. Let's begin his plans before we get to battles. Now we're going to have 3 important battles by name. 3 important battles by name. But let's discuss some of the preparatory plans. We'll begin up with the overhead. Now the first thing that he had to do was to secure his northern border after the death of Philip of Macedon, which would be over here in Thracia. Because of the assassination of Philip, obviously people nearby take that as an opportunity to maybe take some land back that Philip had taken from them. So the first thing that he has to do is to secure the northern border of these invading tribes of the Thracians. Now, while he's fighting in Thrace, rumor spreads south that he was killed in battle. And you know what happens when that happens? Everyone revolts again. So Thebes, not on the map, but ancient Thebes right here. Thebes is the first and the major city to revolt. It revolts, it slays some of the Macedonian leaders, military leaders that Alexander had left behind. Alexander returns shortly thereafter, crushes the city brutally, and sells the people into slavery, to show, no doubt, that he'll tolerate no autonomous city-state in Greece anymore. This is what the whole thing of Philip and Alexander is about, bringing an end to the way of life of the autonomy of the city-states. So it's a brutal crushing of a Greek city, fellow Hellenes to Alexander, and a selling of the people into slavery. With this accomplished, the Greek mainland is secure again. Then he's ready to fulfill the second part of Philip's dream, which is to conquer the world. With a small Macedonian army, relatively small Macedonian army, a staff of historians, botanists, geographers, scientists of every sort under heaven. I mean, can you believe that a world conqueror is going to be sure he takes his physicists along with him, because they're going to study things and they're going to write records about things, especially when they get down to Egypt. That's where they really have their heyday, this staff that he takes with him. With a small Macedonian army, he crosses the Dardanelles, he crosses the Hellespont, the exact same point where Xerxes had crossed 150 years before. This reads like textbook material. It is, but it was real life at that time as well. He crosses at the exact same place where Xerxes had lined his boats up, tied them together with those cables, and brought these hundreds of thousands of men across. Crosses at the exact same place. Not with convoy of boats like that, because he has a relatively small army. After he has crossed the Dardanelles, that's Troas, he first comes to Troy, which is in this general region of Troas, as we've shown you before. He first comes to Troy, offers sacrifice to the gods of the Trojans, in paying homage to the conqueror of them. He's trying to honor Achilles. Achilles is his major idol of warfare that he worships and attempts to emulate. There are a number of Greek games and sacrifices and all types of things that are going on here in Troy for a short period of time while he's honoring the dead Achilles. Remember, he's carrying the Iliad along with him. The king in Persia at this time is Darius Kodamanus, or we'll refer to him as Darius III, 336 to 331. Now notice that the dates do correspond. Alexander and Darius come to the throne at the same time. Darius in 336, Alexander in 336, the year that Philip, his father, was murdered by an assassin. So Darius III will be the Persian king that we have reference to, who also is the personal leader of the army. Now it doesn't take very long for the wind to carry the news eastwardly to Persia, what's on the mind of this new upstart king in Greece. And so Darius III does not wait for Alexander to reach Persia. Darius III, while things are going on with Alexander personally in subduing Thrace and resubduing the revolting city of Thebes again and so forth, Darius III has come from Persia, way over here, the other side of Assyria, the other side of Babylon, the other side of Mesopotamia, come all the way here, traveled through Asia, traveled up through Asia Minor, and is camped right about here with a huge army of men, several 100,000 at the least. Now these names will be provided for you on your chart, and the dates are correct as well. The first major pitched battle between the upstart Greek nation, vying to become a new world empire, and the Persian nation is the Battle of Granicus, or the Battle of Granicus, in the year 334 BC. There are going to be three important battles. I don't know if we could say any is more important. Obviously, you'd say the last one maybe it would be the most important, since that's the end. That's true, and the middle one really is the sounding defeat. But the first one is very important because it's the first battle and Alexander's victorious in it. So they're all very, very important battles. That's why we specify them separately. The Battle of Granicus. Granicus is a 56-mile long river still there in Turkey today. Obviously it's known by a different name, that flows north through Asia Minor and empties into the Marmara Sea. The Marmara Sea is the sea between the Black Sea and the Aegean Sea, the sea right here, or the sea between the Hellespont or the Dardanelles, and on the other end, the eastern end, the northeastern end, the Bosporus Straits. This is the Marmara Sea. Here's the Black Sea, here's the Bosporus Straits. This is Istanbul or Constantinople or Byzantium. Marmara Sea, Dardanelles or Hellespont. And the river, 56 miles long, flows north and empties here into the Marmara Sea, at that time known as the Granicus River. So here's the first confrontation right at the mouth of the river, just as it empties into the Marmara Sea. M-A-R-M-A-R-A. And of course, they're soundly defeated, the Persians, by Alexander and his small army, small in comparison to the hordes of Persians that are brought the year 334 BC. Alexander then marches south. Darius III then heads back towards Persia. He's going to get a new group of people and come back that we'll discuss in a moment. It's not traced out for you on this map. If you can't remember this in your mind, you can draw you a little map of Turkey on your paper or something, and I can show you, in essence, where he goes. Now, we're not going to mention every stop. He's fighting, well, I'll say that in a moment. He's fighting other battles here. We're only going to name a couple of these that are very, very important. But he travels south and resubjects all of these various cities in Asia Minor, any of the ones that are not subject to Greece at this time. Remember, there was always a battle for these cities right here in Asia Minor between Persia and Greece. Sometimes Persia had them, sometimes Greece had them. It was back and forth. So no doubt some of these were already controlled by the nation of Greece at this time, and some were not. Those that were not, then Alexander liberated them from the Persian rule. Some of them didn't want to be liberated, but he liberated them nevertheless. And it takes several years working his way down through here, down this direction. We get down here in this direction, and it's just about time for a new battle. Another important general of his is about here, around the Sardis area. Goes up here. Alexander goes up here. They meet on this map, the middle of Galatia. It passed through the Sicilian Straits, or the Sicilian Pass, which was the only pass. Probably the Apostle Paul went through the same path several hundred years later. The only pass through the mountains there. Passes through that, and the next place we're going to come to in our next battle is going to be right here in just a moment. Meanwhile, before we get to that, he shows his brilliance in that when he comes to these various cities and retakes them and reconquers them from the Persians, or maybe just puts them more under the control of Greece, he shows his brilliance by not coming in and flaunting his control, by not coming in and destroying the temples of their gods and goddesses and so forth, if they chose to worship some other gods and he chose to worship. He came in meekly, he condescended to their level. He allowed them to go ahead and have their religions and their customs. He respected their various religions and their customs that they had. And no doubt this is one of several reasons why Alexander was as successful as he was in history. You see, things like that just don't happen for no reason at all. How a young 20-year-old can capture the whole world. So he's using diplomacy in addition to his military tactics. And his diplomacy is very, very effective. Let me tell you one story to give you one insight into maybe an English figure of speech that you've heard people use and maybe you do not know what it means. If you've never heard it, I'll provide you with something new to impress someone with. There's a story, and it seems to be true, of one king in Phrygia named Gordius. How many of you know what I'm going to talk about? Well, I'll tell you, maybe you've never heard of this. There was a king in Phrygia named Gordius who, just before the time of Alexander, had tied a knot. And prophecy from the oracles of the gods had predicted that whoever could untie this complicated knot tied by Gordius, prophecy had predicted that whoever could untie this would be the master and the ruler of Asia. And Alexander comes on the scene into the same place in Phrygia. The knot is preserved there, triple Boy Scout knot or whatever it was. The knot is preserved there, and Alexander's in too much of a hurry to untie it, so he pulls out his sword and he cuts it in half, which breaks the two strands of rope that had been tied before. And thus, you can probably look it up in the dictionary, people refer to cutting the Gordian knot. Cutting the Gordian knot is just a figure of speech for doing something quickly in a way that's quicker to do it than the long way of sitting there untying all this, but gets the job done nevertheless. You solve a problem in a quick manner. That's referred to as cutting the Gordian knot. You see, that has a basis in ancient Greek history, right at the time of Alexander. And that's used right in our country all the time. I hear people use it. I've seen it in the newspaper before. Someone cut the Gordian knot. You think, cut the Gordian knot? Does that have anything to do with the umbilical cord? People get all tied up then. It has nothing to do with that at all. But it means that you solve a problem quickly. The problem is solved even though you did it a quicker way. You didn't do it the orthodox prescribed manner in which you should have done it. So after all that has been accomplished, we have taken up only a year of time. And by this time Alexander is down here. And we have our second of the three important battles, the Battle of Issus, I-S-S-U-S, in the year 333 B.C. Alexander this time has caught wind of the fact that Darius is returning to meet him with a force of 500,000 men. And so Alexander, who is in this region, when he hears the news, makes it up here to rejoin a general of his, and they make it down here, right in this area, to a city known as Issus. They go very, very quickly. They have the place where they want the battle to be fought. They're already there. They already have it picked out before Darius III gets there. Darius III has come with 500,000 men. No one knows exactly how many men Alexander had, but maybe not even half as many as Darius III Codomanus had. So we're talking about odds greater than 2-1. But again, here's the brilliance of Alexander the Great as a military general. He picks a plane that's so small it won't hold 500,000 men. He picks it small enough so he can get his men in there, and whatever's left over, Darius can fill it up. And as Darius fills it up, he slaughters the Persians. You see, you don't always have to have more in number, just more upstairs, as they say. And you'll be the victor. So they meet in a narrow plain, the narrow plain of Issus. And this narrow plain is what hurts the large 500,000 man force of Darius. Alexander wins a quick victory. Another point of his superiority is his quickness. Now, I'm thinking of a lot of things in the back of my mind. You need to write things down like that. You wouldn't know to otherwise, but that was predicted in the Bible, that one thing that would characterize Alexander is his quickness as he moved his troops from one point to another. Anyone who knows prophecy in Scripture knows that's true in the Bible. I haven't even decided yet whether I want to show you all those neat and interesting verses yet. They really would tie in here real well, but then it would spoil some other things. So I don't know if we'll get to those. But you can trust me, I trust, that the Bible predicted, these mundane things that we're talking about. Someone says, why talk about Alexander the Great? Well, the Bible does. Why talk about each campaign? Well, the Bible does. They're all predicted in the Bible. Well, why try to describe what was going through Alexander the Great's mind at this time and how he made his plans? Because the Bible does. We're looking back on it. The Bible was looking ahead of time. And God, by His Spirit, speaking through the prophets, was saying these very things. That Alexander would be known for his quickness. And it's his quickness, what I say, he got here before Darius the Third did. That's what won the Battle of Issus for him. The Bible predicted all of that. That because he could move, because he had small numbers, he could move his forces more rapidly in these great 500,000-man armies. And because he could move them more rapidly, he'd be in position sooner. And because he was in position, he could pick the position that he desired. And because he could do that, he slaughtered the Persians. So the Battle of Issus in 333. Still tempted to turn over there and look at those verses, but just be assured that they're in the Bible. I don't know yet whether we're going to look. Some of these we're going to have to probably look at, and maybe we'll look at more of those next week.
For the continue.
Still tempted to turn over there and look at those verses, but just be assured that they're in the Bible. I don't know yet whether we're going to look. Some of these we're going to have to probably look at, and maybe we'll look at more of those next week. So he captures the whole treasury of Darius. Darius brought his bank account with him. He captured the whole thing and the whole family of the king as well. His wife, his servants, his children, everyone. And Darius, along with a few Persians, flees for his life. And they're led in their fleeing away by Darius. And Alexander very wisely decides not to pursue him. I'm sure he could have pursued at this time and overcome him. But he decided not to pursue, but rather to let them beat a retreat back to Persia, and him turn south through Syria, Palestine, to get down to this intriguing, mysterious country of the ancient pharaohs, the country of Egypt. It had always been intriguing to the Greek people because of this ancient civilization that Egypt was known for. And so we're going to give you a few things as he makes his way south through Syria and Palestine to get into Egypt, and maybe make a few comments that relate to the biblical record as well. Now, as he's going along the coast from Issus, he's going to take right along the coast all the way down, come across over here into Egypt. Right down the coast through Syria, Palestine, into Egypt. As he's going down the coast, almost all of the cities just surrender to him automatically. News of a defeat like Issus would travel quickly. But there were two exceptions. And before I give you those exceptions, let me tell you another meanwhile. Meanwhile, Darius is making a series of offers, two that I remember, two offers to Alexander to get Alexander to return him his family and his bank account, and to go back to Greece. But Alexander's tasted too much to give up now. He wants the world. He makes some things like, we'll let you have all of these cities you've taken. Well, he's got them. What do you mean you're going to let me have them? I took them, whether you wanted me to have them or not. But he makes two weak offers. We'll let you control Asia Minor as long as you go back home to Greece. Both of the offers are turned down by Alexander, and he sends the heralds back to Darius. There were two exceptions of these cities in Syria and Palestine that did not surrender immediately to Alexander. The first of those was the ancient Phoenician port of Tyre. The ancient Phoenician port of Tyre. You can barely see it on the map in the print, but you can see where the pointer is. Here, Alexander, frustratingly enough, is engaged in a 7-month siege of the city of Tyre. Now, how many of you here know anything about the critical problems that relate to the fall of the city of Tyre? Oh, someone does. Someone's been reading something besides Baptist Quarterlies. Well, let's just state a few things for the record and then pass on beyond it, and at least make you aware now of the fact there are some important critical problems that relate to the fall of the city of Tyre. The fall of the city of Tyre is prophesied in several places in the Scriptures, the two most important being Isaiah 23 I don't know if we want to spend too much time looking at the chapter. You see, we could get bogged down here in the prophecies of the literary prophets. But like verse 9, Isaiah 23 and verse 9. Isaiah 23:9, the Lord of hosts hath purposed it. Well, let's take the first verse, the burden of Tyre. So we know we're talking about Tyre, the burden of Tyre, which was one of the ancient important Phoenician seaports. We've talked even about Phoenicia before, how the Persians had got the Phoenicians to build some of their boats for them. Remember, the Phoenicians were master builders in wood because of the cedars of Lebanon. You know of that phrase throughout the Old Testament, the cedars of Lebanon. They were perfect trees for building of boats and Solomon's temple and a whole lot of other things. The Lord of hosts hath purposed, verse 9, it to stain the pride of all glory and to bring into contempt all the honorable of the earth. Pass through thy land as a river, O daughter of Tarshish. There is no more strength. He stretched out his hand over the sea. He shook the kingdoms. The Lord hath given a commandment against the merchant city to destroy the strongholds thereof. He said, Thou shalt no more rejoice, O thou oppressed virgin, daughter of Zidon. Arise, pass over to Kittim, and there also shalt thou have no rest. Behold, the land of the Chaldeans. This people was not, till the Assyrian founded it for them that dwell in the wilderness. Well, that's an interesting backing up of what we have over in the Table of Nations in Genesis 10. I don't even know if we ever used that verse before, but that's an interesting verse. It proves what was stated in Genesis 10. They set up the towers thereof, they raised up the palaces thereof, he brought it to ruin. Verse 15, it shall come to pass in that day that Tyre shall be forgotten 70 years, according to the days of one king. And after the end of 70 years shall Tyre sing as an harlot. Verse 17, it shall come to pass after the end of 70 years that the Lord will visit Tyre, and she shall turn to her hire, and shall commit fornication with all the kingdoms of the world upon the face of the earth. Her merchandise and her hire shall be holiness to the Lord, shall not be treasure nor laid up, for merchandise shall be for them that dwell before the Lord to eat sufficiently, and for durable clothing. A lot of interesting things there. But the chief prophecy is over in Ezekiel 26, 27, and 28. 3 chapters of the book of Ezekiel take up a lamentation, prophecy, a burden against the city of Tyre. 26, 27, 28. Now, giving them to you in reverse order, 28, chapter 28, the end of it's going to go on and speak about Zidon, which is beyond speaking about Tyre. The middle part of the chapter, Ezekiel 28, seems to carry a reference even past the earthly king of Tyre, which I don't think we need to get into. Then the first part mentions by name in verse 2, Son of man, say unto the prince of Tyrus, or Tyre, that your heart is lifted up and so forth, I'll bring you down to the earth. Chapter 27 is a beautiful description of the time of prosperity in Tyre. Beautiful description of Tyre's prosperity, her commerce, and her relationship with all of her trading neighbors. Interesting, it goes back and mentions, like in verse 13, Javan and Tubal and Meshech, It even mentions Judah and Israel in verse 17 and their relationship to the city of Tyre. Javan in verse 19, that's just an old word for Greece. Arabia, verse 21, Kedar, Sheba. Verse 23, Ashur. Verse 25, the ships of Tarshish did sing of thee in thy market. Thou wast replenished and made very glorious in the midst of the sea. It's kind of a praise of the prosperity of Tyre. Chapter 27 is the prophecy proper of the destruction of the city. And let me call your attention, though, to verse 7. This gets a little bit into the critical problems. There's just a whole lot of confusion in these literary prophets and what they've said concerning the connection between Tyre and Babylon and Tyre and Greece. So what can we do here with verse 7? Remember what we're talking about. We're talking now about the 7-month siege in the year 332, which I haven't given you yet, but 332, the seven-month siege of Tyre by Alexander the Great. Verse 7, thus saith the Lord God, behold, I will bring upon Tyre Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, a king of kings from the north, with horses and chariots and horsemen and companies with much people. And we go back in history, and I think it's just after the fall of Jerusalem, 586, around 585, Nebuchadnezzar storms Tyre, and I don't remember the figures exactly, but I believe he's in for a 13-year siege of the city. Alexander the Great's doing good for 7 months. The 13-year, somewhere in that neighborhood, siege of the city of Tyre by Nebuchadnezzar. And so the arguments then, from verse 8 on through verse 21, the arguments concern themselves with Alexander the Great versus Nebuchadnezzar and the subject of the prophecy here of Ezekiel chapter 26. For instance, let me just pick out a verse. For instance, verse 14. I'm just kind of playing around the edge of the water with it now to alert you to the fact there are critical problems relating to the fall of Tyre. Verse 14, I will make thee like the top of a rock. Now what does that mean? It doesn't seem to have any relation to verse 7 and the conquest of Nebuchadnezzar. Because we could give you some of the history of that, of this 13-year siege of Nebuchadnezzar, and it doesn't seem like verse 14 relates to that. But notice there's no great change. I mean, it just says, verse 7, we're starting into a new paragraph, and he said, behold, I'll bring Nebuchadnezzar upon Tyre. And then it goes right on through to the end of the chapter until you can tell verse 1 of the next chapter is a change of thought. Now the word of the Lord came unto me again, saying. And then the rest of that verse, thou shalt be a place to spread nets upon. Thou shalt be built no more, for I, the Lord, have spoken it, saith the Lord God. Hey, by the way, he said you would be built no more. Now, if Nebuchadnezzar is the antecedent to this prophecy, then it wasn't fulfilled because it was built so that Alexander can destroy it again in 332 BC. So you see, you're beginning to see anyway some of the problems that we have with the fall of the city of Tyre. So we'll look at that another time whenever we look at that another time. We'll look at that then. I can't tell you when we're going to look at that. But there are some critical problems. So we'll just stay with what the facts of history provide for us, and that is that Alexander, in a 7-month siege of the city of Tyre, took it in the year 332 BC. Now, if any of you know anything more, then you know that we could get into a discussion of the eastern and the western taking of the city and the two sections of the city, and maybe that would help solve Babylon-Greece problems, but I don't think we'll get into that. But be that as it may, with the conquest of Alexander, assuming that what Ezekiel gave us is true in verse 7, that somehow Nebuchadnezzar conquered Tyre as well, it's the conquering of the city under the hands of Alexander the Great that bring the final ruin to this great Phoenician maritime port as well as empire. It's the basis for the Phoenician Maritime Empire, the port basis for all of that, as you can see if you read chapter 27. That's why they're in order. I gave them to you backwards because we wanted to save what we're talking about, the 26th chapter, for last. But if you read them in order, you've got 26, then you've got this description of what type of maritime empire it really was in chapter 27, and then chapter 28, the prophecy seems to extend further than just the literal prince of Tyre. So there's the first exception to all of the cities in Syria and Palestine surrendering to him. The second exception is Gaza, the city of Gaza in Palestine, which is just a little bit further down the coast, about the last city that you'll come to if you're working your way from Tyre on down towards Egypt. Now here we have a shorter siege, anywhere from 2 to 5 months. Alexander's wounded during this period. And there's another interesting remark we can make about the siege of Gaza. We're only bringing up 2 cities besides these 3 important battles, Tyre and Gaza, because there are important comments we can make about them. Tyre, the critical problems relating to the fall of Tyre. Gaza, because in the writings of Flavius Josephus, we are told that it was during this 2 to 3 to 5 month siege of Gaza that Alexander took a break personally from a siege of the city. The siege continued. Took a break and traveled up to Jerusalem, met the high priest, whose name was what? Jaddua. We've discussed that enough. Remember, Josephus makes those 3 connections, Darius the Persian, Alexander the Great, and Jaddua. And we discussed Darius the Persian. Maybe it's the second, not the third, and so forth. Flavius Josephus tells us that Alexander went up to Jerusalem, met outside the walls of the city the high priest Jaddua, as well as the other subordinate priest, was shown in the prophecies of Daniel a prediction of the very exploits that Alexander the Great was performing at that time, and that as a result he decides to leave the city of Jerusalem alone. Now I love that story. I wish it were a biblical story. I wish we had support for it. Most of your historians will say we have no support whatsoever for that besides Josephus, and I tend to agree. I'm not saying that it didn't happen. I'm saying we don't know whether it happened. It sounds good. That's why I wish it had biblical support. But we can say this about Alexander the Great. He was a very curious person. He was a worshiper of many gods. He respected other people's religious beliefs. He was very religiously minded, or he wouldn't have gone through what he did in studying the Iliad and the Odyssey and performing the games and sacrifices in honor and memory of Achilles whenever he crossed the Dardanelles into Troy and all of this. And he probably would have been very interested to take a look at this place that was a non-idolatrous city. He'd never seen a non-idolatrous city before, a city that remained true to one and one God only. So if you take all of that into consideration, it's possible that this story in Josephus could be true about Alexander. If he were just some type of individual who would not have taken the time of day to find out about someone's weird religious beliefs, then it just wouldn't fit. But he had a curious mind. He had a mind that was open and receptive to any new ideas and new things. That's what kept him going like that. He was brilliant. He was educated. He was a pupil. He was a learner. He was a student. To find a city that worshiped only one God when the Greeks were known for their pantheon. We gave that to you before. They were known for their pantheon. Here's a city, the only one that he knows in the whole world, that worships only one God. Knowing Alexander's personality like we do, the story could easily be true. He could have gone up, met Jaddua, been shown the prophecies of the prophet Daniel of the prediction of his contemporaneous exploits, and passed the city by as a result. Maybe it's true, maybe it's not. We'll have to wait and see if we get any further support. But remember, the critics can't just say, Well, we have no support for that. We have support in Josephus. So there's support right there. Just that you like things in the mouth of 2 or 3 witnesses before you believe them. Because we do know that he doesn't tell the total truth in other areas. But how do you know when he's not telling if you can't have it confirmed or denied by some other record? Which means you just leave it as it stands. So he goes back to Gaza after this story happened or didn't happen, or he remained at Gaza until the city finally falls. The same year, 332. With that, he goes on into Egypt, liberates the country from the hated Persians. They are grateful for the liberation. He founds one of his 30 cities that he founded while he traveled, the greatest of the 30 that he founded, named after him, Alexandria, Egypt, which will be so very important shortly in history. Beginning of the translation of the Septuagint, the large contingency of Jews in the city, tremendous Jewish population, becomes critically important for the early Egyptian development of theology under Origen, and important down to this day. It's the second largest, the second most important Mediterranean port. There's one in France that's a little more important. And I've been there as well, into the port of Alexandria. We sailed into the port. Tremendous, tremendous. We passed hundreds of ocean and sea-going vessels just on the way into the harbor. Hundreds of them everywhere. Big, huge, super oil tankers. One of the filthiest harbors in the whole world, everyone says, who's been to other places. But it's interesting to be in the city that Alexander the Great himself founded. He founded 30 cities, and that was the most important. There is another story. He was accepted as the direct descendant of the pharaohs. Of course he wasn't. But he was accepted into the city and made a son of the gods. I only share that because I don't know if I want to share any more.
Come on, brother.
Well, Daniel chapter 8,
Hallelujah.
Daniel 8, the first 6 verses, especially verses 5 and 6, we have an animalistic description of the Persian and the Greek Empire. The Greek Empire being in the 5th verse, the Persian Empire being in the 6th verse of Daniel 8. The Persian Empire is described as a ram with 2 horns. Now, I guess you have to get all this down because it's a long story to prove a point. He receives a figure. I think you'll even see his imprint on coins afterwards. But, you know, in these pagan religions, let me just say this, these pagan religions, you have certain animals that are associated with certain religions, like a crocodile or a goat or a ram or something like that. Well, Alexander the Great, what's related to him here while he's in Egypt, is a ram with 2 horns. A ram with 2 horns. As a matter of fact, the writings of the false prophet Mohammed, you know who Mohammed is, founded the Mohammedan Islamic faith, which would have been 9 centuries or so later. The prophet Mohammed referred to Alexander the Great as, you know, one of the most brilliant men who had ever lived before, and he called him the brilliant ram with 2 horns. But the ram with 2 horns here in Daniel's prophecy is not a reference to Greece, it's a reference to Persia. And so here's the point that all of this little historical side note proves. If Daniel really were written, as the critics say, during the Maccabean era, they never would have made the mistake of describing the Persian Empire as a ram with 2 horns, since Alexander the Great by that time was well known to be represented by a ram with 2 horns. You would not have made that mistake because that would have cast a reflection on the believability of your book itself, which is just an interesting side note when you really dig and study to prove that there's no way the prophecy of Daniel could have been written after the time of Alexander. Because you see, what we're saying here is it contradicts that. It contradicts what he became known as afterwards. Now, let me just say this, that because you say, well, it contradicted. The Bible wasn't fulfilled. Well, it was fulfilled. But these points, this goat and this ram, are trying to prove other things. They're not. This is not a prophecy of what he's going to be represented by later on. Or then we do have an error here in Daniel 8, 5, and 6. They're reversed. The goat should be Medo-Persia. The ram with two horns should be Alexander the Great in Greece. But they're trying to prove something else, not his depiction on coins or his depiction in history thereafter. But I find that interesting that if the writer of Daniel would have lived after Alexander, you wouldn't describe Persia as a ram with two horns, because the whole world, down to Mohammed's time, they recognized that Alexander the Great is to be represented as a ram with two horns. You would not have done that, or people would not have believed the writing of your book. Therefore, Daniel must have been written before the critical period for the dating of Daniel, and before the time of Alexander the Great, which we as conservative people and scholars believe. So did you get all that? It's on the tape if you didn't get all those connections. But it's an interesting point. Okay, let's say a few more things and we'll wrap up then this evening. We've gone through two battles, Granicus, Issus. We have a third and final battle in the year 331. Alexander the Great at Gogmela meets the grand army of Darius in the plains of Mesopotamia, just a little bit north and east of Ashur on our map. And this is the final and deciding battle. So he's been here in Egypt. He retraces his steps. Here's Tyre, as you can well see. Gaza would be right about here. He's already fought the Battle of Issus. Remember, we traced it down this way to Egypt. Oh, he travels in Egypt. I don't want to give you all that, but he travels out this direction, down this direction, and so forth. He retraces his steps back up towards Issus, crosses over, and right along here. We're going to meet here in the final battle between Alexander and Darius. He meets the grand army, the main forces, the main reorganized forces at Gaugamela. And all of that's on your chart for you. Now Darius has even more men than he had in the Battle of Issus. But he's again soundly defeated, his forces slaughtered, and he flees toward the east. Alexander the Great starts going after him. He doesn't have to reach Darius because one of the satraps that Darius has taken with him ends up getting a little jealous, and in order to win the favor of Alexander, he murders Darius III, and he ends up being murdered himself. So Alexander starts chasing him. They flee in this direction, but as I say, Darius III is killed, and then the satrap that killed him is killed. So he's not going after him anymore, but he wants to head in this direction anyway. He's already conquered all of this, all of Turkey, all of this area, Egypt, all of this area now has been conquered, which is the same area as ancient Babylon and ancient Assyria and ancient Medo-Persia. These empires that are rising on the scene as prophesied in the prophecies of Daniel. He starts going towards the east. He goes all the way over into the modern country of India. And he even tries to go past this, and his men revolt and refuse to go any further. They're too far away from home. So he acquiesces to their desires. But they conquer India. They just don't go further than that. And he comes back, settles down, and decides to make Babylon the capital of his world empire. Ancient, great city of Babylon. Be a great place for a world leader to make his world empire headquarters. And he does some more traveling in Arabia. There's a planned expedition by ship around Arabia. He never is able to make that. He contracts malaria, which is aggravated by his reckless overindulgence in food and wine. And in the year 323 BC, he dies at the young age of 33, having seen and done more than 10 men combined, living out a full life. He carried the Greek way of life. He carried the Greek thought pattern. He carried the Greek language to all of that part of the world. He even instituted a program of teaching Greek to the Persians and had a class of 50,000 people that they taught Greek to. Big class to grade papers in. But as you can already see for the future, it becomes important for the New Testament because the New Testament is written in Greek. They spoke Greek. Jesus and the apostles spoke Greek. And all of this can be traced back to the time of Alexander the Great and his conquests.